no one knew Elijah was about to disappear. From the outside, he looked fine, sexful, well-groomed, a 32-year-old software developer with a comfortable income and a condo in downtown Los Angeles. But inside, Elijah was vanishing. His laughter had become hollow. His mornings began with dread. His nights ended with scrolling through social media feeds that only deepened the ache in his chest. Then, one night, something snapped. Alone in his apartment, staring blankly at a muted TV, he whispered out loud to himself, "I don't recognize who I am anymore." The next morning, he turned off his phone, shut his laptop, packed a small bag, and drove east. No goodbyes, no explanations, just a note on his fridge that read, "Gone to find silence." 14 hours later, Elijah arrived in Sedona, Arizona. The red rocks rose like ancient guardians, bathed in the golden light of dusk. The air was quiet, not the kind of quiet you get when the noise stops, but a stillness that feels like the earth is holding its breath. Elijah felt like he had stepped into a different dimension. He checked into a tiny off-grid cabin. No internet, no cell signal, just wind, sky, and earth. That first night, he sat alone on the porch under a sky littered with stars. The silence wasn't comforting. It was confronting. Every fear, regret, and buried thought rose up like ghosts he had long avoided. But something about Sedona refused to let him run anymore. He began waking up with the sun. He walked barefoot along rocky trails, feeling every pebble beneath his feet. He plunged into cold streams, not to feel refreshed, but to feel anything again. And slowly, Elijah began to come back to life. He started journaling, not for Instagram, not for therapy, but for truth. He wrote letters to his past self, to his father he hadn't spoken to in years, to the man he wanted to become. And somewhere in that process, he remembered the ancient wisdom he had once studied and forgotten, the Stoic principle that true strength comes not from controlling the world, but from mastering your response to it. On his third night, something shifted. He hiked up to Cathedral Rock just before midnight. The trail was dark, but he moved with purpose. When he reached the summit, the desert spread before him like an infinite canvas. The wind howled, the stars blinked, and for the first time in years, Elijah cried not from despair, but release. He whispered, "I'm still here." That moment was not loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it was the beginning of something unshakable. The Stoics called it building your inner citadella, place inside yourself no storm can reach. Elijah realized he'd been living as if the world owed him peace. But here, in the vast silence of Sedona, he understood, peace is not something you find, it's something you build. Each day after that, he trained like a warrior, not with weights or weapons, but with presence. He practiced cold exposure, sitting calmly in icy creeks while his breath slowed. He embraced negative visualization, imagining the loss of everything he loved, not to scare himself, but to flood his heart with gratitude for what remained. He asked himself each morning, "What can I truly control today?" And each night, he answered. By the end of the week, Elijah didn't have a grand revelation, but something inside him had changed. He no longer felt like he was drowning. He had become quiet and, in that quiet, strong. He hadn't escaped his life. He had it, with armor built not of steel, but of soul. And Sedona, it didn't heal him. It simply reminded him who he was before the noise took over. If you feel even a flicker of connection to Elijah's journey, consider subscribing to this channel. Your support helps us continue creating stories that inspire, heal, and awaken the Stoic fire inside each of us. Elijah's breakthrough moment came during a powerful Stoic practice. What was it? Confronting silence and journaling under the STARSB, enrolling in a wellness retreat with guided meditation. Comment your answer below with A or B, and let us know why you chose it. Layla had always played it safe. She followed the rules, kept her head down, smiled politely, and apologized to much Yvonne when she wasn't at fault. But there comes a moment in some lives when silence turns into suffocation. For Layla, that moment came one late afternoon, while she stood alone in the gallery of a San Francisco art show, not as a featured artist, but as a guest who'd stopped creating out of fear she wasn't good enough. That night, something broke open in her. She went home, pulled out a crumpled flyer she'd picked up weeks ago, and without overthinking, signed up for a rock climbing retreat in Yosemite. No climbing experience, no hiking gear, no real plan. Just a quiet voice inside her whispering, "It's time to face something real." Yosemite greeted her not with comfort, but with challenge. Towering granite walls scraped the sky, and the scent of pine wrapped around the cold morning air. Layla arrived with trembling hands, her heart beating like a drum inside her chest. She didn't belong here, she told herself. Everyone else looked like they'd been born on cliffs, but the guide, a lean woman with sunburned cheeks and calm eyes, only said, "Fear is the invitation. Accept it." The first climb was brutal. Her legs shook, her palms sweated. Halfway up, her mind screamed at her to stop, to go back to safety. But something deeper, fiercer, quieter part of her refused. That part of her was tired of shrinking. So she took another step, then another. Each climb became a lesson. The rock didn't care who she was or what she'd failed at. It didn't reward perfection. It demanded presence. In climbing, she couldn't think about her past rejections or her future fears. Her mind, usually a tornado of doubt, was forced into stillness. The discomfort was not a punishment. It was the path. On the third day, around a fire pit, beneath a sky littered with stars, her instructor introduced her to something called fear mapping. It was a Stoic-inspired tool. Layla was asked to write down her deepest fears, not just surface worries, but the ones that had paralyzed her art, her ambition, her spirit. She wrote, "What if I'm never good enough? What if I embarrass myself? What if I fail again?" Then, beside each fear, she wrote the worst-case scenario. Then what she could do if that scenario came true. Then how she'd recover. The monsters weren't as terrifying once they had names. In fact, many were nothing but shadows once held up to the light. That exercise cracked something open. She realized she'd built her entire life avoiding discomfort, and in doing so, she had also avoided herself. The Stoics believed that discomfort was the furnace of transformation. Layla began to lean into it. Each climb became a ritual of renewal. Every ache in her muscles reminded her, "You are stronger than you think." By the fifth day, she attempted her first solo climb, short but steep. Halfway up, the wind picked up, and her grip faltered. Her instinct was to panic, but she remembered what her instructor said. "Breathe. Don't resist the fear. Acknowledge it, then move through it." Layla closed her eyes. One breath, two. Then she reached, and climbed, and reached again. When she pulled herself over the ledge at the top, there were no cheers. No one even saw it, but that moment became hers forever. She sat on the edge, legs dangling, the valley stretching wide below her. Her chest burned not from fear, but pride. She had not just conquered a climb, she had conquered the smallness she had accepted for too long. She realized that growth was never supposed to feel comfortable, that the path to who we're meant to be is lined with resistance, doubt, and sweat. The goal isn't to eliminate fear, but to move anyway, to show up shaky and try again. When Layla returned to San Francisco, she didn't quit her job or sell her things, or make any grand announcement, but she did pick up her brushes again. And this time, when the voice of doubt crept in, she smiled and kept painting. Because she had touched a truth most people spend their whole lives avoiding. You cannot become who you are meant to be until you are willing to be uncomfortable long enough to meet her. Jason had always been the guy who answered emails before sunrise, returned texts within seconds, and filled his calendar so tightly he had to schedule time just to breathe. Living in Manhattan and working in the tech industry meant speed was survival. Hustle wasn't a choice, it was expected. But over time, something sacred inside him started to fray. What began as ambition had slowly mutated into anxiety. He couldn't remember the last time he had a meal without checking his phone. Conversations blurred. His sleep was shallow, his mind restless. And then one afternoon, standing on a packed subway train, Jason felt his chest tighten. Not metaphorically, literally. A panic attack, his doctor later called it. He went home that night, locked his phone in a drawer, and stared at the ceiling for hours. The silence was terrifying. He realized he couldn't remember who he was without the noise. That was the moment he knew. He had to disappear for a while, not from life, but from the chaos he'd mistaken for living. He called it an experiment. 7 days offline, no texts, no emails, no social media, just a notebook, a few books, and a simple rule. If it didn't recharge him, it didn't belong. The first day felt unbearable. He reached for his phone more than 60 times, out of habit. His mind twitched with phantom notifications. But slowly, minute by minute, something strange began to happen. He started to hear again not the sound of alerts, but the city itself. The hum of the street, the clink of coffee cups, the rustle of wind against windows. Life had texture again. He walked more, sat on park benches, sketched strangers, picked up an old book he never finished in college. He watched the way people moved when they weren't staring at screens, how their eyes wandered, how their hands fidgeted, how their presence made the moment feel more alive. For the first time in years, Jason felt like a witness to the world, rather than a prisoner of it. Midweek, he introduced something he called energy budgeting. Every morning, he gave himself a metaphorical $100 worth of emotional energy. He tracked where it went. Work calls, $30. Shallow small talk, $10. Time spent overthinking old arguments, $15. At the end of the day, he saw clearly how he'd been, bankrupting himself on things that didn't matter. So he started cutting the costs. No to unneeded meetings. No to people who only took. No to that endless scroll that left him empty. Boundaries, he realized, weren't selfish. They were sacred. A form of self-respect. He used to think productivity was the gold, but now he saw that presence was the prize. One evening while walking through Central Park just before sunset, Jason stopped to sit beneath a tree. He hadn't sat still without a screen in his hands in years. As the light faded and the sounds of the city softened, he noticed a couple holding hands, an old man feeding birds, a child laughing. None of them knew him, but somehow, in that quiet moment, he felt more connected to life than he ever had in a boardroom. He pulled out his notebook and wrote one line that stayed with him long after the week ended. I've spent my life running toward success and away from myself. The next day, he turned his phone back on, but it didn't reclaim him. He had turned off every notification except for emergency calls. Social media stayed deleted. He wrote out a new schedule, less packed, more intentional. He replaced screen time with sketching, late nights with silence. He started calling friends instead of texting. He even took up the habit of walking to meetings instead of taking cars 10 minutes alone to breathe, think, and arrive whole. Jason didn't become a monk. He didn't move to a cabin. He simply remembered what the Stoics knew centuries ago. That peace comes not from escaping the world, but from filtering what deserves your energy within it. That guarding your time isn't a barrier, it's a bridge to a deeper life, in the end. What changed wasn't the world, it was how Jason moved through it. Less reactive, more rooted. Less connected digitally, more connected humanly. He hadn't unplugged from life. He had reconnected to what made it worth living. Zoe had always been in control. Every detail of her life was tightly measured: her wardrobe, her resume, her carefully worded emails. As a rising attorney in a high-powered DC law firm, perfection wasn't a preference, it was a survival strategy. Mistakes weren't just errors, they were threats to the image she had spent years polishing. And slowly, that pressure began to bleed into everything. Her joy, her relationships, even her sense of identity. It came to a head one Wednesday night. The elevator lights flickered as she rode alone up to her office. She clutched a motion brief that had taken her 3 sleepless nights to perfect. But her hands were shaking, not from exhaustion, but from something deeper. She couldn't name it yet, but it felt like the unraveling of something that had held her together far too long that weekend. Without telling anyone, she packed a bag and drove west. Her GPS marked the destination with sterile clarity, Grand Canyon National Park. But for Zoe, it wasn't a trip. It was a reckoning. She arrived just before dusk. The air was cooler than she expected, dry still. She walked along the rim, past tourists and shutter clicks, and found a quiet edge with no railing, no distractions. The canyon before her wasn't just a view, it was a mirror. It stretched endlessly, layer after layer, carved by time, not haste. Zoe sat down on a cold rock and stared into it, the wind brushing against her face like a whisper. For the first time in what felt like years, she breathed without urgency. There, in the silence, she realized something. The canyon had no sharp corners, no straight lines. It wasn't tidy. It was beautiful because it was messy, wild, imperfect. And that truth hit her like thunder. She had spent her whole life trying to be the opposite of this clean, controlled, flawless. But the canyon didn't apologize for its edges. Why had she? Over the next 2 days, Zoe wandered. She spoke with strangers, people from places she'd never been, with stories she couldn't predict. An older couple from Sweden who had biked across the USA. Young woman who had just ended a decade-long relationship and come here to cry it out in the arms of something older than her pain. A Navajo guide who spoke of the land as if it had a soul. Each person cracked her open a little more. At night, Zoe practiced a Stoic exercise she had once read about, but never understood until now. The view from above. She would lie down beneath the stars and imagine floating upward past the campsite, above the canyon, beyond the clouds. She pictured her life from the altitude of space, her cases, her deadlines, her fears. They shrank, not because they didn't matter, but because they didn't define her. She began journaling each night, not with bullet points or to-do lists, but with raw honesty. She traced moments from her past college finals, family fights, lost friendships, and noticed something powerful. The events she once thought would break her had, in fact, shaped her. Not in spite of the pain, but because of it. She wrote about amor fati, the Stoic idea of loving one's fate. Not merely accepting the events of life, but embracing them as necessary. The canyon didn't exist in spite of erosion, it existed because of it. Her perfectionism had been a shield, but it had also been a prison. Maybe she didn't need to protect herself so much anymore. On her final morning, Zoe returned to the same overlook where she had first sat. The light hit the rocks differently now, softer, as if the canyon itself had exhaled. She whispered quietly to the open air, "I don't need to be perfect. I just need to be real." She didn't have a plan for what came next, but she didn't need one. For the first time, Zoe felt clarity, not from control, but from surrender. She understood now that perspective wasn't about being above it all. It was about seeing your life clearly, without distortion, without fear. When she returned to DC, nothing had changed. Her office, her cases, her calendar were still there, but she had changed. She no longer saw herself as someone who had to prove her worth through flawless execution. She began to speak more freely in meetings, to take breaks without guilt, to let herself be human in spaces that had once demanded performance. Zoe had found what perfection had always kept just out of reach: peace. And all it took was standing at the edge of something ancient and realizing She was never meant to have all the answers, only the courage to live the questions. Diego didn't speak much at his father's funeral. He stood in a pressed black suit, his shoulders straight, his face composed, but his silence was screaming. In the days that followed, the world moved on, but Diego couldn't. Grief clung to him like a second skin. He tried therapy. He tried journaling. He tried being strong. But no matter how many words he used to describe the pain, none of them helped him escape it. So, 6 months later, Diego flew to Maui, not for a vacation, not for a spiritual retreat. He couldn't even explain it when people asked. All he knew was that the ocean had always reminded him of his father, powerful, unpredictable, humbling. Maybe that's why he ended up at a quiet surf shack just outside of Lahaina, signing up for lessons with no expectation of what he'd find. His first day on the board was a mess. The waves tossed him like a toy, salt water filled his lungs, and his arms burned from the effort. He didn't stand up once, but something about the chaos felt familiar, something about being at the mercy of something bigger than himself felt strangely like home. He came back the next day, and the one after that. The instructor, a local surfer with eyes that looked like they'd seen generations of waves, told him, "You don't fight the ocean. You learn to move with it." That became Diego's meditation. He stopped trying to master the waves and started listening to them, their rhythm, their timing, their mood. Every morning Diego paddled out while the island was still asleep. He watched the sun stretch over the horizon. He breathed with the tide, and somewhere between paddling and wiping out, between falling and rising, something inside him began to loosen. He realized that grief wasn't something to conquer. It wasn't linear or clean. It came in waves, sudden, relentless, and unpredictable. And like surfing, the only way through it was to keep moving, to learn its rhythm, to let go of control. On the 4th day, Diego finally stood. It lasted less than 10 seconds, but in those 10 seconds, time slowed. His body, battered and exhausted, felt weightless. The wave carried him, and for a brief, breathtaking moment, everything made sense, not because it was painless, but because it was honest. Diego began to understand the ancient Stoic idea of aligning with nature, not resisting it. His grief, once a storm he tried to suppress, became part of that natural rhythm. He stopped judging his emotions and started witnessing them. Some days he paddled with purpose, other days he just floated, letting the sea hold what he couldn't. He found a kind of stillness in that motion, sacred in repetition. Movement became meditation. He hiked the cliffs, swam through quiet coves, practiced yoga at sunrise, barefoot on warm sand. He noticed how the island didn't rush, how the trees bent without breaking, how the waves never apologized for crashing. Each evening, he would return to the same spot on the beach, barefoot and silent, watching the sun drop beneath the water like a slow exhale. He no longer tried to make sense of the loss. He just let it exist beside him, like a shadow at dusk. One night as he sat watching the waves in the dark, he whispered aloud, "I miss you, Dad." There was no echo, no answer, just the sound of the tide coming in, going out, and somehow, that was enough. By the end of his 2 weeks, Diego didn't feel healed. He felt whole. Not because the grief was gone, it wasn't, but because he had stopped trying to escape it. He had learned to surf with it, to let it move through him instead of drowning beneath it. Back home, he carried the ocean with him, not in souvenirs or photos, but in how he walked, how he listened, how he breathed. He kept his mornings slow, his movements intentional. He swapped gym workouts for long walks, replaced numbing silence with the hum of nature sounds. He let grief sit beside him at dinner, let memory visit without resistance. Diego didn't need to escape his pain. He needed to move with it. And the waves, wild and unforgiving, taught him what stillness really meant, not the absence of struggle, but the deep, abiding calm that waits underneath it all, if only we are willing to ride it. Ava had everything that should have made her feel full: a steady job in digital marketing, a trendy apartment just outside Washington, D.C., and hundreds of online connections. Her calendar was packed, her inbox flooded, her posts always got likes. But inside, something was missing. Not in a loud, dramatic way, but in a quiet, aching absence that shadowed even her happiest moments. It was during one of her evening walks through the National Mall that she saw it. A folded piece of paper, gently wedged between the slats of a wooden bench facing the World War II memorial. Curiosity pulled her in. She unfolded the page carefully, almost reverently, and began to read. It was a handwritten letter a daughter writing to her father who had passed away. The words were raw and beautiful, trembling with love and longing. Ava read it once, then again, as tears welled unexpectedly in her eyes. It felt like someone had torn open their chest and shared something holy with the world. That letter stayed with her for days. Not just the words, but the bravery of them. The simple act of someone putting pain and memory into ink, then leaving it behind for strangers to witness. It stirred something in Ava that all the noise of her digital life had long drowned out. She began to write. At first, they were just scribbled thoughts, things she wished someone had told her when she was lost. Notes of comfort, phrases of resilience, lines that said, "You matter," or "This too is part of the story." She wrote without knowing where they'd go. Then, one day, she left one in a library book, another tucked into a cafe napkin holder, a third slipped under the windshield wiper of a car parked outside a hospital. She signed them only, "You're not alone." What began as a quiet act of expression turned into a habit, a ritual. Every morning Ava wrote one letter. Every evening, she left it somewhere to be found. There was no announcement, no social media post. It wasn't for followers. It was for connection, for the kind of invisible thread that binds strangers in the shared mystery of being human. Then something remarkable happened. A week later, she returned to the same bench by the memorial. There was another letter, this one addressed to whoever needs it. And then another, and another. Soon, a small community of invisible pen pals formed, people leaving their hearts in paper form across the city, vulnerable and anonymous, yet intimately connected. Ava called it the Letter Project, but for her, it wasn't about the project. It was about feeling human again. It was about touching something real in a world that had grown so sterile with screens and scrolls. She had spent so much of her adult life trying to build a version of herself that looked complete from the outside, only to discover that what she craved most was meaning, not as a concept, but as an experience. The Stoics believed we are threads in a greater tapestry, bound together by our shared mortality and our common need for purpose. Ava had spent years feeling like a loose thread. Now, with every letter she wrote, she felt herself woven back into something larger. She began to take it further, writing legacy notes, letters addressed to the future versions of herself, to a daughter she might one day have, to the teenager she used to be. She'd write them and seal them, knowing she might never read them again, but the act itself was enough. It gave her life a kind of continuity she had never felt before, bridge between who she was, who she'd been, and who she might become. On cold Sunday mornings, she'd walk the city, bundled in a wool coat, dropping letters like seeds, never knowing which would bloom. Some were found and shared online. Others remained a mystery, but the meaning wasn't in the outcome. It was in the offering. Connection, Ava realized, wasn't about being seen. It was about seeing. It was in the choice to care, even when no one was watching. To speak into the silence with the belief that someone, somewhere, might need what you have the courage to give. She still worked her job, still paid bills, still met friends for brunch, and laughed at bad TV. But she moved differently now, more awake, more attuned. She had found a quiet kind of purpose that didn't shout but echoed. Ava hadn't changed the world, but she had started a ripple, and that ripple had changed her. In every letter she left behind, she had hidden a little piece of herself, and in doing so, she had found the one thing she'd been missing all along, not just connection, but meaning. Something real, something lasting, something worth writing about. Each of these 6 lives began in chaos, confusion, or quiet pain. But what connected them wasn't just the struggle. It was the decision to face that struggle, rather than run from it. Elijah drove into the stillness of Sedona, not because he had the answers, but because he couldn't bear the noise anymore. In solitude, he rediscovered his own inner voice, the one that had been drowned out by digital noise and worldly expectations. Through silence and ancient Stoic practices, he built a fortress within himself, one not made of stone, but of clarity. Climbed her first cliff in Yosemite, with trembling hands, and the weight of self-doubt pressing against her ribs. But in each grip, in each reach, she chose discomfort over avoidance. And in that discomfort, she didn't find ease, she found her courage. Her soul grew not in safety, but in struggle. Jason unplugged in the middle of Manhattan, the city that never sleeps, and finally began to rest. His digital detox was more than a break from screens, it was a reclamation of presence. He set boundaries, not just to say no to others, but to say yes to his own well-being. He learned that peace requires protection. Zoe, high-achieving and hollow, stared into the Grand Canyon and saw herself for the first time in years. Not the version polished for success, but the human one, flawed, tired, and yearning for perspective. In that vast silence, she stopped chasing perfection and started living with grace. Diego entered the waves in Maui, not to master surfing, but to survive grief. The ocean taught him that healing doesn't always come through words, it often arrives through movement, surrender, rhythm. He learned that peace isn't always stillness, it's the ability to move with the storm, not against it. And Ava, surrounded by a world of notifications and online noise, chose instead to write letters, words that asked nothing in return. In doing so, she tapped into something timeless, the human need for connection that is real, tangible, and quietly transformative. Her act of giving became the root of her healing. Together, these stories are more than individual transformations. They are a map, a guide back to ourselves. Through solitude, discomfort, boundaries, perspective, movement, and connection, these characters did not escape their problems. They engaged with life more fully. The Stoic truth that underlies each of their journeys is this: you may not control what happens to you, but you can always choose how you respond. You can choose presence over distraction, courage over comfort, meaning over achievement, stillness over speed, depth over noise. So what can you take from this? Start small. One quiet walk without your phone. One journal entry written not for answers, but for honesty. One letter to someone who matters. One moment where you stop reacting and simply breathe. Ask yourself each morning, what do I control today? And each evening, did I live in alignment with who I want to become? Because transformation doesn't begin with massive change. It begins with a decision to turn inward instead of outward, to grow instead of numb, to feel instead of avoid. Now, I want to hear from you. Which of these 6 stories spoke to you the most? Was it Elijah's solitude, Layla's courage, Jason's boundaries, Zoe's perspective, Diego's grief, or Ava's quiet connection? Comment below with your thoughts. Let's create a space where others can learn from your insight, because your story, too, could be the one that shifts someone else's. And if this story moved you, helped you, or made you feel seen, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support is what allows us to keep making content that speaks from the soul and stirs something deeper in all of us. We're just getting started, and the next story might be yours.